Welcome to the Pharma Podcast, conversations with industry experts and business leaders about important and current topics in Canadian pharma, biotech, and medtech. I'm your host, Sam Tarantino. In this episode of the Pharma Podcast, my guest is Lindy Forte, Senior Partner, Health Technology Assessment at Accelera Canada. Lindy is the founder of Patient Access Solutions and brings over 20 years of pharmaceutical and biotech experience in market access. On this podcast, we will discuss the PMPRB and the amendments to the patented medicines regulations and its impact on drug prices in Canada. Welcome to the podcast, Lindy.
Thanks, Sam. It's nice to be here.
So why don't we start with the PMPRB? Who is the PMPRB and what is their role?
Sure. The PMPRB, according to their website, is an independent quasi-judicial body established by Parliament in 1987 under the Patent Act. In lay terms, they have two mandates. So the first mandate is a regulatory role. They state that they protect consumers by ensuring that the prices of patented medicines are not excessive. Their second mandate is a reporting role. They provide information on pricing trends in the pharmaceutical industry via annual reports. So they are a regulatory body. All pharmaceutical manufacturers with patented drugs have to report all of their prices and sales quantities to the PMPRB every 6 months. And the PMPRB reviews the reports and makes judgments about whether the prices are excessive or not. They also determine the list prices that manufacturers can sell their products in Canada.
So this podcast was originally scheduled as a post-implementation podcast because the guidelines were supposed to take effect January the 1st.
Right.
They've since been delayed to July 1st.
Yes.
2021. Yeah. So, what are the changes that are being proposed in the new guidelines?
Sure. I can provide a high-level overview of the changes. The actual guideline document is huge. There's a lot of nuances, but at a really high level, the main changes are the fact that the basket of comparator countries against which Canadian prices are judged has changed. So in the, quote, old basket, the comparator countries that PMPRB referenced are Italy, France, Germany, Sweden, Switzerland, the UK, and the US. In the new basket, there are now, instead of 7 countries, there are now 11 comparator countries. And I think the most notable changes are the removal of the US and Switzerland. Those two countries were typically thought of as, or typically were, higher priced countries. And the new basket of 11 includes some lower price countries, most notably Japan. On an operational level, the guidelines were to judge Canadian prices against a median, and effectively that usually excluded the highest cost countries and the lowest cost countries. So what we're finding, if we compare our clients' medications, the older basket and the newer basket, there isn't that big of a change because the median is often in the European basket. And so that's consistent with the old guidelines and the new guidelines. I'm not saying that the prices will be exactly the same, but it's not, at least we haven't seen a hugely dramatic change. So the basket has changed, but also the determination of the list price, the mechanism there has changed, where I actually prefer the new guidelines because an interim list price and a final list price are set according to the international median. This is in the new system. In the prior system, there was a determination of the value of the products, the clinical value, relative to comparators in our market here in Canada. And so what was happening was the expert committee that makes the decision would often look to lower cost comparators, whether they were really clinically valid comparators or not. And this was done, I think, in an effort to bring down the list price of drugs in Canada. So we would see reports of the two bodies that informed the expert committee. There would be a determination that there are no valid comparators, and yet for some inexplicable reason, the expert committee would take those two reports that were consistent in stating that there are no valid comparators, and the expert committee would say there are valid comparators. Here are the comparators. In some cases, they were really low-cost alternatives. I even saw one situation where it was an over-the-counter medication. So I actually am in favor of the new guidelines, some aspects of the new guidelines. Of course, the devil will be in the details. We don't have experience with the new guidelines. And frankly, the rollout of the new guidelines has not been adequate yet. There's a lack of transparency. And there were to be numerous workshops and information sessions in the fall, and those sessions were canceled. And now we see that the guidelines have been delayed. The reason for the delay is cited to be COVID-19. And my hope is that the Canadian government has realized that innovative pharmaceutical manufacturers are important partners for government. We maintain health of Canadians, and it's this industry that has mobilized very quickly to bring COVID vaccines to the market. And I think there is some recognition of the value of the manufacturers.
What about the guidelines? Will they have any impact on public and private reimbursement?
I don't see the guidelines having an impact. Right now, the system we have is that all drugs drugs are reviewed through the Health Technology Assessment Organizations, so CADTH for rest of Canada and INESS for Quebec. And those bodies are making the recommendations on the clinical and the economic value of the new medications. And then we go through a process driven by the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, which is the price negotiation where there is bulk buying. The provinces get together and negotiate acceptable prices under product listing agreements. And these prices that are being negotiated are probably not dissimilar from the rebate prices or the negotiated prices for some of the European markets. I think with a mandated rebate price through the PMPRB, if the PMPRB is successful in going forth, I think we will net out at a similar place. It's just a different way of getting there. So there's a list price and there's a negotiated price that's not in the public domain. And then following through all of those processes, then the provinces and the private insurers will reimburse the drugs in the same manner.
What about, is there any risk to new launches, new drugs being launched in Canada as a result of the PMPRB, these changes?
I foresee that the new medications will still come to market in Canada, but there is a potential for delays. So the way the new guidelines are built, they're very dependent on setting the list price according to that basket of 11. Mm-hmm. In order to set a list price, the medication should be launched in at least 5 other countries. And so we've seen situations in the past where sometimes medications come to Canada first. And there is some potential now that in order to secure a list price that's acceptable for launch in Canada, there may be a preference on the part of some manufacturers. I'm sure they'll still want to be doing all of the analysis and the work towards bringing the drugs to market, but I think there's potential that the actual launches may be delayed. And that's unfortunate for patients who are waiting and needing the medications.
What about rare diseases, drugs for specialized drugs and drugs for rare disease? Do you see any particular challenges?
Well, the new guidelines actually really seem to be targeted, I don't want to say against the drugs for rare diseases, but there are additional analyses and hurdles that are put in place to scrutinize the cost of drugs for rare diseases. And I think where this thinking is coming from is that because they're small populations, there's some unfairness in that higher costs are allowed or attributed to those drugs for very small populations. And conversely, this is exactly the reason why the drugs for rare diseases are priced higher. It's because the effort to bring them to market is similar to the effort that's required to bring a blockbuster to market. And it's harder for manufacturers to recoup those costs when the costs are spread out over a smaller segment of the population. And my feeling is that, individuals that are born with genetic conditions, with rare disease, they're disadvantaged already, and to have higher scrutiny on the costs of those drugs and potentially risk delays in coming to market in Canada is a further disadvantage and inequity for those patients. And so I would like to see the conditions for setting the rebate prices in particular of those medications, I'd like to see them relaxed. Although I have noted that in contrast to the system we have now, where after we get a positive recommendation from the health technology assessment organizations, we go negotiate on the price, the rebate price of those drugs, and there's no minimum amount of sales that is permitted at the list price. The negotiated price is on the first dollar sold. What we see in the new guidelines is some allowance for up to $12 million in annual sales before the rebates kick in. So this seems to be an improvement actually in the guidelines, but as I mentioned before, we're not really sure about the interplay between what we have now, the negotiation with the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance versus the actual mandated rebate prices through the PMPRB. We don't know how that interplay will play out. And then the other thing I wanted to say about the drugs for rare diseases is, there is an unequal focus, I think, on the cost of those medications. And I think that the government has to some degree lost sight of the fact that the total cost of all medications to treat these genetic conditions is still only 2 or 2.5% of the total pharmaceutical spend. I think what the PMPRB sometimes has done when they're publishing their reports is they bring in the cost of oncology drugs, which are initially maybe targeted towards more rare cancers, but over time, because of their efficacy in cancer, they are approved for more and more indications, which increases their market size, and they would no longer be considered really truly a drug for rare disease. So what the PMPRB has done in their analysis is lumped in the cost of the rare oncology drugs, and they're showing that the total cost then of the expensive drugs for rare disease are about 10% of the market, where we're really focusing on the real drugs for rare diseases to target the orphan disease, the genetic conditions that individuals are born with. And that's still a tiny, tiny, tiny part of the pharmaceutical market in Canada.
So in terms of a final takeaway, the new guidelines? Good, bad, neutral?
Well, time will tell, of course. As I said, we don't have the experience with those new guidelines that we have with the older guidelines. On paper, I'm encouraged. I think there are some aspects of the guidelines that will make it much easier for us to plan. You can't plan for whether the expert committee will designate your drug a breakthrough or a substantial improvement or a moderate improvement. In the new system we have, the list prices are set according to the international basket. I think it's much easier to make plans in that environment. It's much more straightforward. And as I said too, even in the case of a higher cost medication, a category 1 medication, there seems to be an allowance for at least $12 million in revenue before the rebates kick in. So I'm really encouraged about the future. I'm hopeful that these new guidelines will play out as written, and we're anxiously awaiting to see how the guidelines will be implemented. There needs to be more education in our industry and with the public to reassure patients and manufacturers that Canada, there won't be delays in bringing drugs to market in Canada.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for your time. How can the audience connect with you?
Through my email, which is Lindy, Lindy .Forte, Forte, at Accelera Canada, all one word, .com.
Contact details for Lindy will also be available on our website at thepharmapodcast.ca. Thank you for listening. This podcast can be found on our website at thepharmapodcast.ca. The Pharma Podcast is also available to listen to for free on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and Google Podcast. The Pharma Podcast YouTube channel will also be launching very soon, so please stay tuned. Thank you to our sound engineer, Errol Francis. Please subscribe and follow me on LinkedIn to stay up to date on future podcasts. If you would like to be a guest on this podcast, or if there's a topic we should cover in future podcasts, please connect with me via LinkedIn.